On the night the engagement ring slid onto her finger, Leila felt the room tilt, not from champagne or music, but from the heavy, unfamiliar gravity of being seen. Voices ebbed and swelled around her. Congratulations, toasts, little jokes folded into polite laughter, but each syllable struck like scenery passing by a train window. Her mind kept returning to the stillness behind Ion's eyes when he had taken her hand. In that small, bright oval of pupil and iris, she had glimpsed something impossible. Herself, reflected back with such exactness it felt like a small, reckless mercy. People called it a lucky match, others called it practical. Leila did not know which name fit the knot tightening in her chest. She had practiced the smile for months, soft, grateful, composed. Yet beneath it something raw leaned forward, impatient and uninvited. She had rehearsed what to say to her mother, to Ion's friends, even to the old woman in the elevator who asked, with the frankness of strangers, whether she was sure. None of those rehearsed answers reached the truth that rose now. Fear threaded with hope, and a question that clung to her like a cooling cup of tea. Could she finally be the person someone else chose to hold? Outside, the city lights stole the edges of the night. Inside, Ion's voice, low and unadorned, threaded through the clamor. "Forever?" he asked, and when she looked up and found her own face tremulous in his gaze, she whispered yes before she understood why. Leila's apartment was modest. 2 rooms, a bookshelf with more notebooks than novels, a small balcony with a fern she had almost killed twice, and then coaxed back to stubborn life. She worked evenings at a language center, teaching adults to say words they had always meant to say. She measured her days in lesson plans and late-night tea. She had built herself on careful increments, on small choices selected like stepping stones across a river she had never trusted. Engagement had not been one of those small choices. It arrived like a tide, sudden, inevitable, and the water it left behind kept revealing things she hadn't wanted to face. The first true crack opened at breakfast 3 mornings after the engagement party. Her mother, a woman whose love had always smelled faintly of rose water and laundry soap, sat across from her with a face that did not match the softness of her hands. "You look tired," she said, stirring her tea. When Leila laughed, some of the sound had an unsteady edge. "It was a long night," she offered. Her mother didn't reply immediately. The teacup moved, the spoon tapping like small punctuation. "Ion's family asked about the wedding date," she said finally. "They're good people, Leila. You'll have to think about the ceremony. Which hall? Which caterer? And your sister, do you want her to be a bridesmaid or just help out?" Leila felt the list act like a summons. Decisions she had not imagined making yet, colors, guests, traditions. Each item made the room smaller. "We'll talk," she said, but the words fell thin. Outside the apartment window, a delivery truck rumbled past, the driver's radio spilling an advert for loans and weddings, unavoidable. Leila's phone chimed. A message from Sarah, her oldest friend. "Are you excited yet?" With a small, breathy exhale, Leila pictured Ion's hand on hers and the reflection she'd seen. Her own face, outlined inside the dark of his eyes, like a photograph sandwiched into glass. For a sudden, dizzying second, she had felt seen in a way that unlatched something guarded. Then came the echo. What if being seen meant being judged more sharply, made smaller by the eyes that were supposed to love her? Ion arrived that night with a bag of groceries and the calm of someone used to carrying order into chaos. He moved through the apartment with a practiced ease, unpacking vegetables, humming as he arranged jars in the small kitchen. He had been precise from the outset, the kind of man whose lists never betrayed him. His love, too, was precise. Steady calls, punctual visits, a warmth that fit around the edges of Leila's cracked places without asking for them to be explained. They ate in companionable silence for the first half hour. The radio hummed something soft and forgettable. Then, over a peeled orange, Ion's expression shifted. He set the fruit down and folded his hands. "My father called," he said. "He mentioned the engagement. He thought of some traditions, some guests. He asked about your family, Leila." Leila's pulse eased slightly. Confrontation was, strangely, less frightening than the quiet. "What did he say?" "He asked if your family would agree to certain things. He wants to make sure both families are comfortable." Her mouth tightened. The words "certain things" landed with an odd bluntness, as if something practical had been substituted for the tenderness she felt in Ion's eyes. "Like what?" she asked. Ion's shoulders rose. He didn't list them. He worries about appearances, about how things will look to people who matter. The sentence was smaller than the anxiety it demanded. Leila thought of the photograph that had gone viral 2 years earlier, an intimate portrait of her at a protest, paint flecking her cheek, eyes defiant under a banner. She had thought then that anonymity was a cloak. In the digital age, that cloak had holes. Her face had been in the wrong column for some, a name attached to ideas some found inconvenient. For others, it was admirable. For gatekeepers like Ion's father, it might be a reason for disquiet. "Leila," Ion said, reaching for her hand. His fingers were warm and sure. "I love you. I want us to be aligned." His use of the word aligned stabbed at her. She had never seen herself as a problem to be arranged, as an asset to be matched to the right ledger or the right expectation. She felt the syllables of her life being measured against paragraphs she didn't yet know how to read. Her voice, when it came, surprised her with its steadiness. "Aligned how?" Ion hesitated. For the first time since they'd met, she saw the faint tremor in the map of him, uncertainty. "He thinks certain people at his office would notice. He thinks a quieter approach would help with business partnerships. I don't know, Leila. He said he just wants things to go smoothly." The phrase, "go smoothly," felt like an oil spreading over a crack, smoothing it until the break disappeared, but the structure beneath was left weaker. Leila's chest tightened. She remembered the times she had been laughed at in school for arguing too loudly or for speaking up in ways that did not align with the polite maps of others. She remembered the nights when she had given talks, heart galloping, and then at home her roommate would say, "You were brave," and she would think, brave to risk being seen. "It doesn't matter what other people think," she said, and it sounded at once like a truth and a plea to Ion, to herself. Ion's eyes searched hers for the safe harbor he had always felt, and for a moment she saw fear, not of her but of the consequences he imagined. "It matters to them," he said quietly. "And it matters to my father. I don't want to upset him." The chasm the words exposed was not an immediate catastrophe. It felt like a fissure that would widen if ignored, seeded by a conversation whose roots went back farther than the two of them. Leila found herself thinking of Ion's childhood, a boy raised to file his life into tidy boxes, and then of her own. A girl who had learned to speak loud enough to be heard over the hum of 1,000 small injustices. Two people, different grammars. That week, rumors began to gather like cloud over their small orbit. An aunt's offhand comment at the bangle shop, "Isn't she a little too outspoken?" A cousin's laughter at a family dinner. Will she be able to keep up? All of it threaded through with questions about decorum and suitability. Leila felt watched, not by lovers but by appraisers. Each remark carved a small hollow of doubt. Work became a refuge and a battleground. Students who had looked to her for clarity now hung back. Their eyes flicked with the tentative caution of people who feared association might cost them safety. A parent of one of her students, political leanings known and vocal, paused by the door after class and said, "I heard about your engagement. Congratulations. I hope it doesn't change your approach in the classroom." The implied accusation, change or compromise, settled into the skin like a bruise. Inside Leila, the old practice script stirred. Be modest, be accommodating, shrink when necessary. But unlike earlier days, she now had Ion's hand on her, and that doubled everything. Doubts magnified, hopes magnified, the stakes real and immediate. If she allowed herself to be reshaped to make others comfortable, she would be relinquishing the very truth Ion had once reflected back to her in his eyes. One evening, after a meeting with the center's director about fundraising, a dinner where Ion's family friends might be present, Leila returned home to find a printed invitation on her table. Ion had been to see his father. The paper smelled of the fancy paper his father favored. Boldly printed in tasteful script were suggested guest lists and a line that read, "Recommended. Minimize political friends and events during engagement period." The sentence read like an erasure. Leila sank into a chair and let the apartment darken around her. She thought of all the small acts that had taught her who she was. The chalk-stained fingers after a mural, the trembling voice that had read poetry at a rally, The late-night phone calls to a cousin overseas about injustice. Each thing seemed suddenly negotiable, and the bargaining was not with fate but with the people who loved her. She felt rage mounting, not loud and eruptive, but steady and hot, like water warming in a pot until it might spill. When Ion came home that night, he found her staring at the invitation. He took it gently from the table, as if it were fragile, and read the line with a furrowed brow. "I didn't agree to this," he said. His voice was small, not the commanding timbre she had sometimes heard in office meetings, but a private sound. "I promised my father I would consider his suggestions." "You promised him consideration of what?" Leila's question was soft, but each word had an edge. "Your life or his comfort." Ion opened his mouth. For a breathless second, the apartment hung in a brittle silence. Then he sat across from her and, with an uncharacteristic bluntness, said, "I don't know how to be what both of my worlds demand, Leila. I love you, but sometimes I think the safest path is the one that inconveniences the fewest people." There it was, the demand to be less, to edit herself down until she fit into the neat compartments others had planned. Leila felt the room tilt again, but this time it was not the dizzying wonder of being seen. It was vertigo at the loss of herself. Tears gathered like dew on the lashes she had not bothered to remove. "Is that what I am to you?" she whispered. "An inconvenience to be managed." Ion reached for her hand, and this time his fingers trembled. "No," he said. "You are—" He stopped because the words for what he felt were not the same as the words his father wanted to hear. The silence that followed was not the clean, calming quiet of two people agreeing to sleep. It was the heavy hush that arrives before something significant shifts. In that silence, Leila realized the conflict was not simply external pressures or Ion's filial obligations. It was the collision of two visions, one of a life unclipped by fear, and one of a life smoothed for safety. For the first time, she understood that love, no matter how earnest, might ask for sacrifices that would cost her the very parts she prized. She stood, palms flat against the table, and looked at Ion, really looked, searching the familiar landscape of him as if mapping a new country. His jaw was softer than the picture she'd held in the quiet of their first months together. Lines that had seemed charming now read like compromises he had learned to live with. "I need to know if you are willing to be with me, without erasing me to keep us comfortable," she said. The words left her like a dare and a prayer. Ion's eyes flickered, there and then gone. He seemed to wrestle a decision he had not expected to make so early. Outside, a bus sighed past and someone laughed on the street below. The world went on, indifferent and loud. "Yes," he said at last, and his voice held an ache that belied the simplicity of the syllable. "I want to, but I don't know how to fight the world and my family. I don't know where to start." And so the first true conflict was set. It was not merely about parties or guest lists, but about identity and acceptance. Leila stood at the edge of a path she had never mapped. On one side lay compromise and a comfortable, risk-averse life. On the other, jagged terrain strewn with the possibility of being her whole, unmuted self. The problem, she realized with a chill clarity, was whether love could be the bridge or whether it would become the scaffold upon which others built their expectations. She touched her finger, now heavy with the ring Ion had placed there, and felt both its weight and its promise. In his eyes, earlier that night, she had seen herself reflected as someone worthy of devotion. Now that reflection demanded a choice from both of them. The decision they would make in the days to come would test not only what they felt for each other, but how much of themselves they were willing to negotiate for the sake of being together. Leila let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. She could not yet see how the path would bend. She only knew that it would demand courage she had not called upon in a long time. For the first time since the engagement, the thought of being whispered to, forever, felt like the beginning of a trial, not merely a promise. The weeks that followed the argument with Ion unspooled with the slow, insistent pull of tide. Life at the language center kept its rhythms, registrations, lesson plans, the polite chaos of adult learners fumbling over verb tenses. But under those routines, everything felt different. Leila moved through her days with a new vigilance, as if the world contained a microphone that amplified every small judgment. Her students still admired her lessons. They still praised her warmth and clarity. But there were furtive glances and conversations that trailed off when she entered a room. Her name, once a small, familiar bell, now seemed to carry weight. Sarah was the first person Leila called. They met at their usual spot, a cafe on a narrow street with plants trailing from the balcony and a barista who had memorized Leila's complicated coffee order. Sarah arrived in her usual raucous mood, bright scarf tied like a question mark, and the same ready laughter that had steadied Leila through every adolescent upheaval. "You look like you're holding back a secret," Sarah said, sliding into the seat across from Leila and scanning the face she had known since childhood. Leila told her everything: Ion's father, the invitation, the suggested guest list, and the line about minimizing political friends. As she spoke, the words came out sharper than she expected, edged with a hurt that had been lodged for days. Sarah set down her cup and reached across the table. "So," she said, carefully, "what are you going to do?" Leila considered the question. It was not simply about responding to the suggestion. It was about choosing the terms on which she would exist in someone else's household, and perhaps in society's gaze. She had always prided herself on being honest, sometimes to a fault, and now honesty felt fragile. "I don't know," she admitted. "I love Ion, he's steady, but I can't be the version of myself that hides important parts of who I am." Sarah's fingers curled around her cup. "Then don't hide. And whatever you do, make sure he's with you, not for the shape he thinks you should take." Her friend's words were blunt and real, a compass point. Leila left the cafe feeling less alone. She began to imagine conversations she would have with Ion, gentle and fierce both, where they would redefine what aligned meant for them. Love that required erasure was not love she wanted to build on. At home, however, reality kept complicating plans. Ion was trying. He attended some meetings with his father and then returned with more confusion on his face than before, as if the more he tried to translate his father's fears into reason, the less sense they made. Between his love for Leila and his loyalty to his family, he seemed pulled thin. Sometimes he would call late, voice a rasp with exhaustion. Other times he would be insistent about small practicalities that had nothing to do with arguments, as if clinging to management could steady the unease. There were good moments. On one humid evening, Ion surprised her with 2 tickets to a small theater production, a modern adaptation of an old love story. They sat in the dusty lights and laughed, and for a while, being near him felt like a shelter. In those hours, Leila saw the tenderness that had first made her accept his hand. The way he watched without interrupting, the tiny attentions. A coat draped over her shoulders when the theater draft nipped, a hand finding hers in the dark. She remembered the reflection in his eyes from the engagement night and the small, exact relief that had accompanied it. Those memories made choosing feel like a brittle thing. She did not want to end the warmth they had, but the darker tides kept returning. A cousin's wedding brought Ion's family in the same room as hers for the first time since the engagement notice. It was supposed to be a celebration, but the air thrummed with politeness that avoided landmines by skirting the truth. Conversations skimmed the surface, talk of work, sports, weather. Leila watched the faces, cataloging the ways people arranged themselves, who smiled and who watched critically. She noticed, too, the way guests cataloged her history like a list of potential problems. A whispered recollection here, an ironic chuckle there. Ion's father, dignified and exacting, moved through the room like someone aligning chess pieces. After the dinner, Leila retreated to the balcony to let the humid air cool her cheeks. Ion came to stand beside her, his silence tender at first, then insistent. "I tried to talk to him today," he said. "I told him about your work, about how important it is to you. He swallowed. He asked me if I was sure about us." Leila could see how the question slotted between Ion's loyalty and his love. "What did you say?" she asked. "I said he should trust me, He searched for a line and found it. "That people change, and if I love someone, I don't want their past to become a measure against them." Those words should have been a salve. Instead, they felt like a promise that required proof. Leila wanted to be believed in whole. But belief alone, without the willingness to protect and stand up in moments of challenge, was not enough. Days folded into one another. Ayan's father called with questions that sounded like concern, but felt like inquiries into leverage. "Would you consider stepping back from public events during the engagement season?" he asked once, in that even tone that had made negotiation sound like inevitability. "There will be guests from some partners who prefer a quieter period. It's nothing personal." "To step back from public events, are you asking me to stop doing my job?" Leila asked, when Ayan relayed the conversation. She felt hot and tired. "My work is part of who I am." "It's not that simple for him," Ayan said. "There are his business considerations." The word business, cold, practical, was repeatedly invoked as a reason for constraint. Leila began to feel as if her activism and voice were nuisances to be turned off like lights when visitors arrived. Pressure mounted externally in the form of social whispers and invitations rescinded, and internally in the form of a persistent ache of small humiliations. There was also a steady drip of consequences. An editor rescinding a speaking invitation for Leila at a civic forum with a vague concern about optics. A quiet withdrawal of a sponsor for the language center after an anonymous complaint. The needle of compromise moved not into empty space, but into livelihoods and reputations. Amid this, Ayan once proposed a joint meeting. He would bring his father to meet Leila in a neutral place, to build a bridge. Leila agreed, wanting to be fair, wanting to try. The coffee shop where they met smelled of roasted beans and polite intentions. Ayan's father arrived with an entourage of calm composure and a fine grasp of filial expectation. He greeted Leila with formal kindness, hand extended, eyes assessing, and spoke in the careful cadence of someone used to steering outcomes. "I have heard much about your work," he said, eyes steady. "I understand you are active." Leila felt the word active pronouncing accusation and pride at once. She chose honesty. "Yes," she said. "I organize, I teach, and I speak. I believe in voice. I've always believed in it." Ayan's father listened, small movements of his head acknowledging the information. He then spoke of concern, about partners, about public image, about finances, and how ripples of perception could affect business. He did not use harsh words. His tone was civilized, but his civility enclosed judgment. Leila answered. She spoke openly about what her work meant to her, about evenings teaching a woman who had never had schooling, about a child reciting a new phrase in English for the first time, about how voice changed lives. She did not plead. She did not capitulate. She told stories the way she taught students, concrete, human, impossible to dismiss easily. At the table, Ayan's father said nothing for a beat that felt long enough to be a verdict. Then he offered a compromise. She might reduce public appearances for a short period and emphasize private community work, projects that would be less publicized. "Just till the wedding," he suggested. The phrase landed like a net thrown over an animal. It contained intention without cruelty, but the implication was clear. Reduce the visibility of the parts that made her both visible and vital. Leila thought of the woman at her center who had, earlier that year, read a poem at an event and later said, hesitantly but fiercely, "Now I feel like I can speak up." She thought of the students who had found confidence through her classes. To silence those parts for an occasion that was socially convenient felt like erasing small triumphs that belonged to other people too. She listened, then thanked him for the offer, and left with polite restraint. On the walk home, Ayan's hand around hers was tense. "What did you think?" he asked. "I can't step back from who I am," she said. "Not for a window of time, not for a wedding." Ayan's face shifted, not with anger but with the brittle sorrow of someone caught between worlds. "My father, he is worried about stability," he said. "He thinks cuts will make things easier." Leila squeezed his hand, and in that gesture there was both tenderness and warning. "Stability built on compromise that erases me is not stability I can live in," she answered. The weeks continued, a playlist of moments that tested the limits of their union. Confrontations were interspersed with small acts of tenderness. Late-night conversations where Ayan confessed his fear of losing both his family's approval and Leila. Or mornings when Leila would find a small note folded into her jacket pocket, a line that said, simply, "I'm trying." They were learning to translate love into actions. Yet pressure is a subtle thing. It creeps into cracks and molds a life slowly. Leila discovered that some of her own doubts had been growing in secret. The part of her that feared causing rift, the lineage of compromise inherited from the women in her family who had smoothed their edges to keep peace. She could trace the trait back through generations: soft words, swallowed grievances, the heavy cost of being the patient one. She fought to be different. She found allies. Sarah was relentless, arranging small gatherings where Leila's voice was not a liability but a celebration. At work, a few colleagues rallied, offering to speak publicly with her, to share the spotlight. Ion, too, showed growth. He began to take small stands, cancellations of events with his father's guests, quiet refusals to accept language that implied she needed to be hidden. He made mistakes, of course, stumbling in front of his father, apologizing when he shouldn't have, but he was present in the fight, which mattered. Still, the tension grew like a knot tightened by hands that could not fully understand the shape they were binding. Leila realized that the real battleground lay not only in public statements, but in the narratives people told about them. About what marriage should be, the price of respectability, and whose voices were permissible. She watched as friends recalibrated relationships, as invitations lessened, and as a subtle isolation settled like dust. One night, alone in the kitchen, Leila found herself tracing the ring on her finger. It glinted in the light, a small, steady thing. She thought of the reflection in Ion's eyes that first night, and of the whisper of forever. The whisper felt heavier now, layered with expectations she had not anticipated. She drew breath and decided, quietly, that she would not be the kind of partner who asked for invisibility. If being with Ion required her dimming, she would rather let the relationship go than be unfaithful to herself. The next morning she called a meeting with Ion. They sat on the couch, the morning light slanting across them. "I love you," she said. "I want to make this work. But if our togetherness asks me to be a version of myself that I wouldn't recognize, then we have to reevaluate what we're building." Ion's eyes filled with a complex hurt. "I want to be with you, Leila," he murmured. "I'm trying to figure out how to hold both my father and you." They spoke for hours. It was not an end to the problem. It was a negotiation of expectations, a slow rearrangement of assumptions. They mapped concrete steps. Ion would confront his father more directly, refusing to allow invitations to dictate her visibility. Leila would moderate a few public appearances only where safety or professional risk genuinely demanded it, not as a concession to social discomfort. They agreed on lines they would not cross, and on the need to protect one another publicly. For the first time in weeks, relief flushed through Leila like warm water. The compromise felt honest, one that preserved her voice while recognizing pragmatic danger. Their plan was imperfect, but it was theirs. Love, she realized, required more than feeling. It required work and sometimes fierce public defense. Outside, storms of opinion continued their small gusts, but now the winds hit a surface that had been, at least partially, armored. Whether the armor would hold when the true test came, when Ion's father made demands that cut to livelihoods or public safety, remained to be seen. For now, however, they had taken a stand. Not with shouting, but with deliberate, steady action. It was the beginning of a long road, and both of them felt the tremor of what might be lost and what might be won. The day the confrontation arrived, the city was a copper bowl of late sun and heat. Ion's father had arranged a luncheon at one of the club's private rooms, a neutral, polished room where banners of partnerships and oil paintings suggested steadiness and legacy. The gathering was billed as a courtesy. Introductions for business allies, a small celebration of the forthcoming union. Leila had agreed to attend on the condition she could speak briefly about the community project she was launching, an honest, narrow ask to show her work's constructive reach. Ion had promised to back her. Inside the private room, men in pale shirts and pressed suits traded measured compliments. Their laughter was a practiced instrument. Ion's father presided with the composed air of someone who had practiced authority his whole life. When Leila entered, she felt the room tilt into a different kind of light, the glare of inspection rather than warmth. People evaluated the fit of a person in the space the way a tailor checks cloth. Leila's palms were damp when she mounted the small dais. She could feel Ion's presence at her side like a steadying hand. She had spent nights rehearsing what she wanted to say. No grandstanding, just truth, about language and access, the dignity of voice. Her students' faces hovered behind her eyes, a collage of lives she had watched shift. She drew breath and began. "I want to share a story," she said, voice steady at first, then gaining warmth. "About a woman who came to us last winter. She had never been to school. When she left the class the first time, she cried, not because she was sad, but because she had finally found a place where her words meant things." She looked across the room, not at Ion's father, but at the assembled guests as a whole. "That is why I speak, not to provoke without purpose, but to open doors. Small doors become big ones." The room shifted, some faces polite, others guarded. Leila continued, laying out numbers, small wins, testimonies. The talk was factual and human. She expected a swift, civilized end, applause, chatter, an attempt to move on. Instead, at the back of the room, Ion's father's hand tightened around a glass until the knuckles blanched. After she finished, the applause was thin. The room's conversation never fully resumed the same note. It had been interrupted by an honest counter-narrative. Ion's father rose, eyes fixed on her, and spoke with a measured, social smile that did not touch the accusation beneath. "Leila," he said, "we all appreciate civic work, but one learns to be mindful of optics. Business depends on perception. I hope you see the need for prudence." "Prudence," he said. The word landed like a verdict that had been decided long before any testimony. Leila's chest tightened. She had not come for a fight, but she could not leave without answering that tone, patronizing, dismissive. She thought of the woman who had cried with newfound confidence, of students who had translated a single phrase into a lifetime's worth of opportunity. To be told to be prudent felt like being asked to minimize other people's horizons. She met Ion's father's gaze. The room seemed to hold its breath. "Prudence is important," Leila answered calmly. "But prudence should not be a code for silence. There is a difference between careful speech and erasure. If our decisions today mean that some people are denied access to education, then we have chosen convenience over community." A pause stretched. Some faces shifted uncomfortably. Others watched like spectators at a chess match. The father's smile thinned. "That's an admirable sentiment," he said, "but one must consider the consequences. There are partners, clients, who may not approve of public activism. They are our livelihood." Ion's father had framed the stakes as business inevitability, but the subtext was clear: conform or be excluded. The sentence contained an ultimatum wrapped in civility. Leila felt the old fear of losing security, of being the reason for a livelihood shrinking. But this time the fear had an answer. Before she could form it, a voice cut across the room, Ion's. He stood, voice carrying, and there was a firmness in him she had not heard when he'd been apologetic behind closed doors. "My life is not a ledger," he said. "My relationships are not line items to be optimized." The room turned. Ion held Leila's hand then, not possessively but as an ally. "I know the costs my father worries about," he continued, eyes on the older man. "But I will not ask the person I love to disappear to make business comfortable. If our partners value conformity over the dignity of people, then they are partners we must question." It was more than words. It was a public act of choosing. The ripple that followed was immediate. Ion's father's face registered something between shock and fury. He had not expected his son to speak so. He had expected compliance. "You speak as if you know what you ask," the father said, his voice controlled but brittle. "Love is noble, but there are realities, responsibilities. You would put our interests at risk for sentiment." Ion straightened. "I put people first. If that threatens the status quo, then perhaps the status quo needs changing." Then he did something Leila had not dared hope. He pivoted away from rhetoric and spoke to her, softly but for all the room. "Leila," he said, "I don't want to lose you to fear. If those who matter can't accept who you are, then they are not people I want to build with." A hush fell. The father's jaw moved. Some men muttered, some looked at their watches. The social calculus rebalanced in real time. The immediate consequence was cold. Ion's father excused himself, muttered about commitments, and left with a few loyalists in tow. The room's warm tint had cooled. After the father's departure, several guests offered congratulations, some genuine, some cautious. But the public act had been made. Ayan had chosen Leila in front of the very people who had tried to define her. For Leila, the moment crackled with a complex relief. She had been defended not by rhetoric alone, but by alliance, by a man who had shown he could choose love over expediency. Yet as the sun slid lower, relief braided with the knowledge that the confrontation had real costs. Business lines would be reevaluated, invitations would be recalibrated. There would be reprisals, cold shoulders, and the slow thinning of allies. Her phone might ring with opportunities, and then go silent. Walking home that evening, hand in hand, they were quiet. Neither of them spoke of victory. The air between them held a fragile, vital truth. They had crossed a line together, and anything beyond it would be fought hand in hand, or lost hand in hand. Leila pressed her forehead to Ayan's shoulder and heard his steady heartbeat. He whispered, a private sound amid the city's hum, "Forever!" His voice, in that small question, held both challenge and promise. She closed her eyes and felt her reflection, no longer simply mirrored, but standing beside the man who had seen her fully. "Forever!" she breathed back. The word held more weight now than a ring. It held consequence and courage. They had won the skirmish, but the war, the public fallout, the erosion of support, the cost to livelihoods, lay ahead. The climactic confrontation had broken the dam. What followed would be the floodwaters. Messy, unstoppable, and cleansing in ways neither of them could yet predict. The weeks after the luncheon were not cinematic victories. They were collections of small reckonings. News of Ayan's public choice spread quietly at first, through the private networks of the club, the whispers at partnerships meetings, a thin-edged column in a lifestyle newsletter that framed the story as a family dispute. Some doors closed without ceremony. An invitation rescinded, a polite but final email from a sponsor. The Language Center felt tremors too. Donors called with questions. The director fielded cautious meetings about funding sources. Leila braced for ruin. What she found instead was not pure loss but reformation. A few donors withdrew, others, quietly but fiercely, stepped forward. Parents of students made calls, some to express support, some simply to say, "We stand with her." A neighbor who ran a small printing shop began offering discounted banners for Leila's outreach events. Sarah organized a fundraiser in the tiny cafe where they had once patched each other's wounds, packing the place until people were standing on stairs, giving money and stories and time. The community rallied not because of spectacle, but because the work had visible beneficiaries, women who now read election ballots without fear, elders who had learned to navigate forms that once left them helpless. The cost was real, but it changed shape. Rather than the quiet extinguishing of her public life, Leila's visibility narrowed into a clearer, more fierce light. She no longer spoke at venues where compromise would be required. Instead, she doubled down on grassroots work, door-to-door literacy nights, informal conversation circles in community centers, small-scale workshops that produced measurable change. The work demanded more of her hours, less of her glamour, and gave back more of the immediate satisfaction she cherished. It was exhausting and bracing in equal measure. Ayan weathered his own consequences. Business associates grumbled. Some friends withdrew with an economy of goodbyes. His father's circle cooled, and for a time the elder man spoke to his son in lines that were formal and clipped. Yet in the private space of their apartment, Ayan's dedication deepened. He learned to be audibly, actively protective, phoning a partner to explain, walking into a meeting and taking a seat by Leila as if anchoring her presence, or simply sitting in the front row at her community nights. These acts mattered. They were small but constant, an aggregate of courage that steadied Leila when the currents pulled. Their intimacy changed too. Where earlier their love had been safe mostly within domestic rituals, shared groceries, the routine of returning keys, now it had the texture of solidarity. They negotiated boundaries with a new vocabulary. What could be publicly said, what must be defended, where to hold space for one another's vulnerabilities. Arguments remained, but they were different, less about who was right and more about how to fight external battles without searing one another. A turning point came unexpectedly on a humid afternoon in late summer. Ion's father had invited them, reluctantly, to a small family gathering at his house. The overture arrived folded into an invitation that smelled faintly of civility. Leila almost declined. The memory of the luncheon and the father's cool exit lingered, but Ion's hand on hers was insistent. "I want him to see you," he said. "I want him to meet the people you help." They arrived to an older house that held the scent of lemon polish and books, not ostentatious but comfortable. The initial conversation circled the kind of civilities that felt like warm-up acts before the serious stuff. Then, as if the universe were arranging a lesson, the elderly neighbor, a stooped woman named Amna who had learned to read because of Leila's evening class, arrived unexpectedly with a small tray of sweets. She greeted the father with the plain courtesy of someone who had been taught manners, but who carried gratitude like a garment. "Mr. Kana," Amna said in the same language the father used with his staff, "I came to thank your daughter's teacher. She helped me read my grandson's hospital papers. I would not have understood them otherwise. She has given me words to keep my family safe." The elder man's expression did not soften easily. There was a pause long enough for breath to stall. Then, in a motion almost imperceptible, his face rearranged, small cracks opening where his armor had lain. He asked questions, practical ones at first. How many students? What did it cost? Who taught? Amna answered with the blunt dignity of someone who had regained autonomy. Leila, with the habitual calm she used in class, explained the program, the budgets, the outcomes. Ion watched his father with a tightness that finally eased. The father, who had been taught to measure value in ledgers and contracts, listened to a woman who had been sheltered by quiet necessity explain how a single literacy night had kept a grandson alive by enabling family members to understand consent forms. The arithmetic the father had always used, profits, optics, partners, began to be recalculated by the simple logic of human consequence. When Leila left the room for a moment to pour tea, Ion's father took off his cufflinks slowly and then, with a gravity that Leila would later replay in memory like film, told his son, "You were right to stand by what matters." It was not a full reconciliation. The elder man's warm handclasp was not a categorical endorsement, but it was a fissure widened by empathy. It did not repair everything that had been torn. It opened a possibility. Fathers, after all, learned slowly. In other corners, progress came in quieter forms. A former patron of the language center, moved by a story she had read online about Leila's community night, donated a classroom in a nearby building so the center could expand its evening programs. One of Ion's business partners, chafing at the earlier friction, privately met Leila and later asked how he could help, sending supplies and volunteers. The world did not revolve neatly back to its prior orbit. It reconfigured itself around new alignments. But the cost was not only external. Leila learned to rest differently, to surrender illusions that courage always looked the same. She grieved the loss of some social simplicities, the brunches that had been easy, the acquaintances who evaporated. But she celebrated the reciprocity of community. The nights when students brought homemade food after a session, the new volunteer who had once been a beneficiary and who now led small groups with a fierce competence. She also discovered the surprising tenderness of compromise when it was mutual and not coerced. Ion would still sometimes consult his father, but now he did so with a spine that bent toward Leila's truth rather than away from it. Over time, their engagement took on the scale it deserved, smaller than some speculated and richer than others imagined. The ceremony was intimate. Friends from the language center sat beside Ion's colleagues who had come because they believed in the couple. Sarah read a poem that made half the room cry. Amna embroidered a napkin with a small pattern she called words to give to Leila. Ion's father attended and did not make a speech about propriety. Instead, he offered a simple blessing and clapped at the end as if the applause could stitch what had been frayed. On the night they officially promised themselves to one another, Leila looked into Ion's eyes and found the reflection of someone who did not ask her to vanish. In his gaze, she saw not a mirror of herself alone, but a landscape where both of them stood, each visible and protected. The whisper of forever had changed, no longer a passive vow but a promise of mutual witnessing. The days that followed were not free of complication. There were lawsuits and administrative worries to handle at the center. There were nights when exhaustion made arguments flare. But the pattern was altered. They began to move forward as partners in the most literal sense, sharing burdens, strategizing, apologizing when either failed. Their fights were less about identity and more about logistics or fatigue. In the quiet aftermath of those nights, they would find each other again, hands like scaffolding. Leila's reputation changed, too. She became known not as trouble but as someone who built tools. Her student success stories began to populate local papers and social feeds. And while some platforms still preferred sanitized narratives, the grassroots momentum was real. She realized, with a cautious joy, that the price she had feared paying had been transformed into currency that bought other people language, agency, and the ability to act. And Ayan's father, though cautious, began to attend some community nights as an observer. He did not always speak warmly. Sometimes his silence remained the armor of habit. But occasionally he would stay afterwards and ask a practical question about budgeting. A small, tangible sign that he was engaging with the work, not merely condemning it. In those months, Leila learned a new kind of breathing, one less frantic, less defensive. She still woke some mornings to the ache of vigilance, but more often she woke to plans. Lesson plans, community outreach, quiet dinners with Ayan where they mapped future ideas. The life they built was not a neat compromise but a layered weave. Threads taken from history, from courage, and from the daily choices to defend one another. They had not erased the wounds of the conflict. They had seamed them into a pattern that told their story. In learning to defend herself and each other, Leila had drawn lines around the life she would not surrender. The whisper of forever had become a chorus of small daily choices, each one a promise made visible. Years later, Leila would sometimes stand at the language center's window and watch students fold into classrooms like a tide. She would think of the ring that had once felt like a promise with terms she didn't understand. She would remember the glare of inspection and the hush of approval. The landscape of her life had been remade not by a single triumphant moment, but by the accumulation of choices. Bold, small, stubborn. Ayan remained her anchor and her fellow traveler. Imperfect, learning, sometimes clumsy, often steady. Their love, refined by public tests and private negotiations, was no fairy tale but a practiced craft. They continued to disagree, to forgive, and to defend. His father, who still kept his distance in certain company rooms, had come to attend a late-night class once, and when he left, had quietly contributed funds to expand afternoon tutoring. It was neither full acceptance nor total defeat. It was a begrudging, human acknowledgement that people could evolve. Leila had learned the most vital lesson of all. That being seen was not a demand for perfection, but an invitation to be known, in all the messy dimensions that made a person whole. Forever, she realized, was not the absence of storms, but the decision to stand in the rain together.